Hello, everyone. It is Stefan Bertram and Ben Burgess coming to you live for Philosophy for the People. I think this is the first time in a while that we are both wearing t-shirts, so clearly summer has arrived.
Fair enough.
It's very warm here, but I imagine it's warmer where you are.
Probably. I will say that I feel like this is a little bit of false advertising. My understanding from movies and TV shows is that mid-June in Southern California is supposed to be a little bit sunnier than this.
It's been very, very sunny here to the jealousy of some Americans I talk to. I think Jason especially, who's like, why the fuck am I in Mexico if it's not sunny? Um, but it's interesting today reading your essay, which is on possible worlds and possible worlds being real or actual or something like that,
Mhm.
which is called modal realism. It was interesting, I think, and it's kind of an interesting thing about intuitions. People have the idea of intuitions as like kind of our pure, unreflective first initial thought on something,
Yeah.
and not something which kind of develops. I think what's interesting is for me, actually, the idea that you point out, which is kind of absurd, of when I'm saying Julius Caesar could have lived longer if he hadn't gone to the Senate. I can't remember if that's the actual example,
Yes.
but something along those lines. You say what I'm obviously not saying there is in this other real world uh, where this happened, he would have lived longer. But I think I'm so kind of alternate history pilled. I'm like, no, actually, that's kind of what I think about, and kind of the absurdity of modal realism is not on like first glance, but like on second glance when you start thinking about, well, okay, now there's a lot of worlds, aren't there? There's like an infinite number of worlds, um, and interestingly, in a way, if all possible worlds exist, it means each world is necessary, which is kind of what we were trying to avoid in the first place.
Right. Um, so one thing we definitely don't want to think is that everything that happened is the only thing that could have happened. Like this is sort of one of the basic intuitions driving people like Lewis to think about any of this stuff in the first place. That like it sure seems to be true that sometimes like one thing happened, but something else could have happened instead, and if that thing had happened, this other thing would have happened. Like statements like that pretty routinely seem to be right. It'd be really weird to say that like every such statement was wrong, and this is this way that things happen is the only way they possibly could have been. This is the kind of thing that drives people to think about modal logic, which is the branch of logic dealing with possibility and necessity, and certainly it's the kind of thing uh, that motivates people like David Lewis, the guy with the excellent beard in the thumbnail, to start thinking about possible worlds. But yeah, on his sort of strange account, I see your point. There is a way that we're sort of back to saying that what happened, what actually did happen, was inevitable. So what Lewis thinks, we talked about this a little bit last week, both in the YouTube chat and in the essay last week. Um, and it's recapped here, and I talk more about it. Is that Lewis thinks that everything that what it means to say Julius Caesar would have lived longer if he hadn't gone to the Senate on the Ides of March is that in the possible worlds where he didn't go to the Senate, he lived longer, or whatever. Maybe the closest possible worlds, which just means the ones that are the most similar to ours in other ways that are relevant. where he didn't go to the
But
Senate.
it seems like we're trying to talk about our world, right?
Yeah, so this is one of my objections that I raise in the essay. So Lewis's view is that when we talk about possible worlds, we say something could have happened. We mean there's at least one possible world where it does happen. Uh, if we say that something had to happen, we mean that it happens in all the possible worlds, etc. Um, and when Lewis says possible world, I mean that's a phrase that different theorists can use to mean very different things. But Lewis had this view he calls genuine modal realism, which says no. The word world means exactly the same thing we talk about a possible world that it means when we talk about like the world, meaning like everything there is throughout all space and time, that totality of everything there's ever been or will ever be. That's a world. You say there's more than one of them. In fact, there are an infinite number of those, and this is supposed to explain all of these kinds of conceptual problems about thinking when we say such and such didn't happen but coulda, or if Caesar had stayed home from the Senate, he would have lived longer. And what it is that makes these sentences true, because normally we think that that truth is about conformity between what we say and objective external reality. Well, here you go. Here's some objective external reality for our statements about possibility and necessity to conform to make them true. And so that's Lewis's view. And in the essay, what I'm talking about this week is why I don't agree, because I kind of gone through Lewis in a very quick way at the beginning of last week's, and I sort of said, well, look, it really doesn't seem to me that this is the sort of thing that you can establish by philosophical arguments. That there are all of these like
proving the existence of every possible concrete object, which is infinitely more than science has done or ever will do.
Yeah, I mean, like a way of getting at the sort of epistemic intuition I was appealing to there is if you think like, all right, if I gave you some kind of pure philosophical argument, there was no reference to any kind of empirical evidence. I was just like thinking about concepts, and the conclusion of my argument was that there's a hitherto undiscovered planet whose orbit is obscured, and in our observations by I don't know Jupiter, you would say, well, hold on, don't we need evidence for that? I mean, surely we can't establish something like that just by a priori reasoning, just by thinking really hard. And if you think about Lewis, I mean, look, he's saying that he's making a much bolder claim than there's just one extra planet. He's saying there's an infinity of other planets and galaxies and Julius Caesar counterparts and Big Bangs and everything, right? Bens and Stefans, right? Like all of those things, right? That there's an infinity of other ones besides the one we know about. That's a much. It seems to me that that's a claim of the same type as the planet one, but it's a impossibly more expansive and therefore harder to prove one. And that he's not really making it on the basis of evidence. He's making it on the basis of philosophical arguments. And like, there's something that should be suspicious about that. It's like, it really doesn't seem like we should be able to do that. So that's basically all I said about Lewis last week. But then I wanted to come back to him this week because if I sort of leave it at that, it's like, well, okay, but Lewis does make all these arguments for it. I mean, if it turned out that he had a really good case and there were no good objections, then all right, maybe that epistemic intuition I'm appealing to is wrong. Maybe, I mean, if you say nobody could possibly establish X on the basis of philosophical arguments, and somebody says, well, here's my philosophical argument for X. What's wrong with it? Um, like, you know, you can't just sort of bang the table and it says, nah, it's impossible that you did this. Like, I think you kind of need to show, like, okay, I'm, I'm actually looking at the details of the view, and here's why, here's why I don't think the case quite works.
So, quite a big part of this essay is on common sense,
Yeah,
which I think is definitely an interesting topic. But kind of both you and David Lewis seem to take the idea seriously that we should be concerned with common sense, in which he does give a case for. But what's your reasoning? Like, I don't know, physicists obviously are probably like slightly interested in kind of folk physics or naive physics or whatever. But they don't like if the experiments say otherwise, and they're like, well, they can toss off.
yeah. Well, I think the key part of that is if the experiments say otherwise, right? I mean, I think that's pretty much what physicists should think. I think that, like, um, I mean, sometimes there's a question of how to, interpret the result, like some sort of results of experiments. And, the obvious case would be quantum mechanics. And there, I think that, like,
I mean, even just stuff like heavier things should fall faster.
should, no, sure, right. So yeah, my point was just going to be, I think that, like, when there's a matter of interpretation, that, like, you have a bunch of theories that sort of otherwise do an equally good job of accommodating the evidence, then even in physics, common sense might get some kind of vote in that process. But yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I do, I do think that, like, physics greater than symbol common sense is a perfectly good principle, right? That you that, like, it commonsensically, like, sure, it seems weird to say such and such, but then, like, hey, check it out. Here's my evidence for such and such. Okay, good. I I would say now you're in possession of a good reason to reject common sense. Um, so, yeah, I think if you have empirical evidence that conflicts with common sense, as in a lot of the physics examples, then you should go with what the empirical evidence says. If even with math, uh, like, there are plenty of things that you can prove with mathematical proofs that, you know wildly fly in the face of common sense, that sound obviously wrong when you first hear them. That, like, some infinities are bigger than other infinities would be a case, or even, like, something as mundane as, like, probability theory, like the Monty Hall stuff. I mean, like, that like, if I'm just kind of if I haven't thought about it in a while, right, it sounds wrong to me again. When I first start to think about it, right? Because I think in a lot of cases, our intuitions about this stuff are just wrong. That's fine, right? I mean, there's nothing infallible about our sort of intuitive sense of what sounds right. Um, so I think there could be a whole list of reasons to reject common sense, um, but I do think it gets some kind of vote, and then especially when you're sort of engaged in pure philosophical speculation that's not really driven by uh, that's not really driven by, like, evidence or anything quite as straightforward as a, like, no, but seriously, you're just wrong about the math. Like, I can show you, right, on a chalkboard. Um, then I think in a situation, like, in a context like that, common sense starts getting a lot more votes. Again, not because it's infallible. I mean, I actually really like the way that Lewis puts it in the passage that I quote in the essay from Plurality of Worlds, where he's like, look, the claim is not that, like we have some sort of faculty of intuitive knowing that's that's like magical and infallible, or that we or that I don't know, the common people feel in their bones, whatever the truth is that highfalutin philosophers have forgotten, or anything like that, right? It's just sort of, I think, a fact about how reasoning works, that you have to start from somewhere. And if you're trying to figure out what, as far as you can tell, is true, and especially in contexts where you don't have much else to go on, then I think there's a certain kind of, usually not a word we like on this channel, but conservatism, whereby all we mean by that is we're maybe we should say conservationism. That's the environment. We're just, that all else being equal, we've got a certain bias in the direction, a certain legitimate bias in the direction of, let's, like, if whatever we started out believing, if we're thinking about new stuff to start believing, then all else being equal, yeah. I mean, if this wildly flies in the face of what otherwise seems to be true, that's a strike against it. The question, I think, is, well, what can, even in that sort of purely philosophical context where we're not talking about empirical evidence, we're not talking about anything as simple as, no, you just got the math wrong, I can show you on the chalkboard. So even in that purely philosophical context, what is it that could kind of justify the trade-off that says, like, okay,
I mean,
something seems...
Lewis, in what you quote, seems to basically make the point that in philosophy, we should be conservative in this way because you never really get these knockdown arguments or knockdown data.
Yeah, exactly, right? So since you don't have these kinds of knockdown arguments against your common sense starting points, that means that the common sense starting points count for more than they would in situations where you do have those kinds of knockdown arguments. And that seems totally right to me. Like, I'm on the same page as him on that general methodological point. But the other half of his point there is, okay, and look, I think a lot of people, when they're talking about the level of abstraction that we have been for the last few minutes, will be like, what is this common sense garbage? I reject that utterly. Your intuitions mean nothing to me. Like, that's how they would talk, because that sounds right to them when they're thinking about it at this level of abstraction. But then if you actually pay careful attention to how they argue, right, they're constantly appealing to what sounds right, because you can't not. There's just no other way to proceed. Again, in the absence of some kind of empirical evidence, or some kind of, something like, no, I can just show you got the math wrong.
Yeah, I mean, like, if there was some kind of logical problem.
Yeah, exactly, right? If you just said, no, this is, I know commonsensically X seems to be true, but really X leads to a logical contradiction, right? Like, that's a knockdown
Like
argument.
when anti-natalists talk about violating the consent of the unborn.
The consent of the unborn, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a fun one. Yeah, because that seems like that could go either way, right? Like,
I mean, it depends exactly what you mean, but if you're saying not, you didn't get their consent, but you're saying you violate their consent, then that's impossible. That didn't happen because that's just impossible.
Yeah, you can't violate somebody's consent if they're not capable of giving or withholding
Yeah.
consent. That seems
But
right. Also, by the
if you're
way,
being
not to,
all careful,
what's
these
up?
things don't these sort of things don't turn up in actual philosophers' arguments
Yeah,
beyond disastrous rarities.
not to mention, and I don't want to get too sidetracked on this, but just because I'm thinking about it, like, to the extent that I can make sense of what's going on, if somebody says that bringing a child into existence, violated the consent to the unborn, um, like, okay, I mean, sure, you're bringing somebody into existence who didn't ask to be brought into existence, but like, if you, they might very well be happy that you did. In fact, in the vast majority of cases, they will be. And in if there's some hypothetical future person who you decided not to bring into existence. Well, you didn't ask them not to do it either. That's like who are you to take away this hypothetical future person's right to exist? I don't think that's a good argument, but it's not obvious to me that it's a worse argument.
Yeah, I mean, there's ways to do it more carefully where you talk about, um, they didn't consent to being born, which is true, instead of talking about violating their consent, which is impossible. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I don't know if you. It's probably too early to talk about what I thought in your essay was a very clever argument.
Okay. Well, so Lewis is making the point that even given everything that we've said for the last few minutes, that Lewis and I agree on, right? That it is that like our sort of commonsensical, intuitive sense of what sounds true, um, as as much as it doesn't doesn't sound very rigorous when you say it out loud like that, is inevitably going to have some role in shaping our theory. It does get a vote. Um, he thinks that it can be outvoted by sufficient theoretical advantages. That if nothing else, certainly one of the things that philosophy is in the business of doing is kind of taking like, okay, here's some stuff over here that seems true, and here's some stuff over there that seems true, and making it more systematic, right? Sort of hammering it into an internally consistent picture, and inevitably when you do that, you are going to lose some stuff. It's not that like everything you thought was true at the beginning of the process is going to be confirmed at the end of the process, and so clearly sometimes we think that like some kind of advantages in kind of making our understanding of the world more rigorous and systematic can justify some loss in initial intuitive plausibility. Uh, that all seems right to me too, right? So what the context here is that Lewis had this fun line that I quoted last week about how you know like he could refute every argument against his position, but he didn't know how to refute an incredulous stare. And which is a good line, but in this passage we've been talking about from On the Plurality of Worlds, like he's actually giving the incredulous stare its due, right? He's saying, okay, when people basically say no, that's ridiculous, right? Like they're incredulously staring at genuine modal realism. The sort of charitable interpretation of their point is that the theoretical advantages of believing in genuine modal realism aren't worth the cost of this extreme alteration in our view of reality. And Lewis says, okay, fair enough. This is a judgment call, but I think it is worth it. So my, what I say in the essay is, look, I disagree. And that's not just for the sort of uninteresting reason, which is that, like, even if it did have the theoretical advantages that Lewis thinks it would, I think this is an awfully big alteration in our understanding of reality. And I don't really think that would be enough to justify it. That's true. I don't. But like, also, if that was all there is to say, it's like, yeah, I'd make a different judgment call. It's a very short essay. So the more interesting point is that I'm not really sold on the idea that genuine modal realism has the advantages that Lewis thinks it does, right? That in other words, if the sort of job description is to make sense of these sort of basic ideas about possibility and necessity and counterfactually, if one thing was true another thing would be true, like if this is the sort of data that it's supposed to accommodate, before we even get to this question of, okay, it does a really good job of explaining all that away, now is that worth the intuitive cost of believing this batshit crazy thing? That question doesn't even arise until we've decided whether it actually does, fulfill the advertised service, right? Whether it really does make sense of all these basic things about possibility, necessity, and counterfactuals. And I just think it doesn't.
And what you bring up at this point, which I very much like, I was like, Ben's. And did you get this argument from anyone, or did you make it up yourself?
This one I think I more or less made up myself because you're talking. Well, which one are you talking about? I
Well,
make two.
I was going to say you bring up impossible worlds.
Yeah, so that one is mostly mine. So like there are certainly lots of people who talked about impossible worlds. Daniel Nolan is the guy that I'm sort of most directly getting that from, but I don't think Nolan really sort of uses it as the objection to Lewis exactly, right? I mean, he sort of says like, "Hey, you know, if you have a not Lewis kind of view of possible worlds, you can also believe in impossible worlds, and blah blah blah, right? But I don't. I'm sure there are. I'm sure somebody does. I don't think I've seen anybody directly use this as an objection to Lewis, but yeah. So I should say, like, basically, I give two examples at the end of the essay of cases where I don't actually think that Lewis's view like delivers the goods. That I don't think it really makes sense of our ideas about possibility, necessity, and all that stuff. So one of them, which is very not original to me, it's a sort of concern that's out there. Saul Kripke says something like this in Damning Necessity. Is well, hold up. If I say, Julius Caesar would have lived longer if he hadn't gone to the Senate, like the subject of that sentence is supposed to be Julius Caesar. That I'm making a claim about what would have happened to him, or that there's some possible course that that guy could have taken, and it's not clear to me that if you just talk about Julius Caesar's counterpart in an alternate reality, the guy who's who's like almost indistinguishable from Julius Caesar and his name Julius Caesar and all that stuff, right? That if you're, I'm not I'm not convinced that any fact about that guy could be what I'm saying when I say Julius Caesar would have lived longer. I mean, the same way that it's like if I don't know. I mean, if I'm cloned, not in the boring thing way that like what cloning actually means in the real world, but like in the fun science fiction way, right? That like I walk into a machine and I walk out, and
It
then,
makes an identical copy.
yeah, it makes an identical copy exactly. Um, and we both leave the room, and I don't know, when we leave the room, uh, um, I have a glass of whiskey, and my clone has a glass of coffee, a cup of coffee, and remember that the clone thinks that he's me, that he looks like me, he answers to my name, all that stuff. Um, if I say if I had if I'd had coffee instead of whiskey, I would feel more alert right now.
We're not talking about him.
I'm not talking about him. I'm talking about me, right? Like the fact that he actually did have coffee instead of whiskey and is more alert right now, that might be evidence for the truth of if I'd had coffee instead of whiskey, I'd be more alert right now. But that's not what makes it true. That's not what I mean, right? It's not a sentence about him. It's a sentence about me. And so this is one of my basic objections to Lewis, that ultimately, if what we're even if we assume for the sake of argument that the infinity of Lewisian concrete, physically real possible worlds all actually exist, um, I don't actually think that they would do the work that Lewis needs them to do. I don't think that like Julius Caesar's counterpart in some other world, not going into the Senate House of that world and living longer, I don't think that would. I mean, if we somehow found out about it, that would give us a reason to think that if our Julius Caesar hadn't gone to the Senate, he would have lived longer. But I don't think that could be what we mean when we say that if our Julius Caesar didn't go to the Senate House, he would have lived longer. right? This is the so that's one thing, and Lewis. I guess I don't really spell this out in the essay. I just kind of say, hey, if you want to know what Lewis says, Lewis is aware of this worry. He's got this chapter in his book about it. I don't really think anything he says quite gets to the nub of the worry, but if you want to check it out, you can, read a chapter of the book and decide for yourself. Like a lot of what he says in there is like, well, here are these other theories of what possible world could mean. They don't really do a better job of addressing this or whatever. It's like, okay, so maybe talk about
Maybe we need a
possible.
new one.
Yeah, maybe talk of possible worlds is just the wrong way to go here. Maybe worlds talk isn't really a good way to explain what we mean by possibility, necessity, and all that stuff.
Right, because I mean, possible worlds talk is new-ish, right? Like 100 years, 150 years. And
Yeah,
obviously, people have grappled with counterfactuals for thousands of years, but only in the past 150 have we kind of talked about possible worlds, which does show, if anyone's wondering, that philosophy does go places, but doesn't mean it goes good places.
that's true. Yeah, I mean, I guess Leibniz has
Oh
some
yeah,
possible worlds talk a few hundred years ago, but whatever. Look, Aristotle was worrying about possibility and necessity, thousands of years ago. So yeah, I think your point is definitely well taken. And yeah, it's a good reason to think that it's like, yeah, okay, so maybe like possible worlds just aren't going to be a super useful concept for clarifying what we mean by possibility and necessity. I think that should totally be on the table as an option in this discussion. But yeah, then the other point is hold up. One of the things that possible worlds talk is supposed to do for us is to explain um, counterfactuals. To say that like if X had happened, Y would have happened, right? To explain stuff like that, and I think there's a specific kind of counterfactuals that Lewis's view actually can't really help us with at all. And the kinds of things I'm thinking of here are counter postulates.
Julius Caesar would be surprised if I stabbed him with a square circle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's yeah the gimmicky thing I used to do in person classes. I would ask ask for a volunteer to come draw something on the board, and when somebody came up, I'd say, okay, draw a square circle, and either they would gamely draw something that was kind of sort of square like, but a little round around the edges, or they would just sort of say, I don't know how to do that. And either way, it'd say, okay, we don't judge you for this because you could not have, right? That given the definitions of circle and square, anything that's circle is not a square and vice versa.
No one came up to the board and like drew like a circle surrounded by a square and said, it's like a tesseract or whatever, and actually in a higher spatial dimension, it is a square circle.
I think there were a couple times that people did draw what you're describing, but I don't think I ever got the tesseract explanation.
Okay.
but, but yeah, it's. But like, it really seems to be true that if when I've been doing this gimmicky thing, if some student had actually succeeded in drawing a round square, I would have been very surprised.
You would have gotten the phone to the New York Times.
Yeah, exactly, right. And whereas that seems to be true, whereas it seems to be false that if they had drawn a round square, I wouldn't have given me a moment's pause, right? That one seems to be false. And it's okay. Like there seem to be a lot of cases like this where we have some pretty clear intuitions about what would be true given various impossible um, impossible antecedents. So if like whatever. I mean, I've done the I used the example about Russell's paradox, which is so according to naive set theory, for every possible description, there's a set of all and only the objects that match that description. Right. So for the description being a round square, there's a set with no members. Right. There's the empty set. For the description, being a dog, there's the set of all dogs. For the description being round or square, there's a set where all the circles and all the squares, are members of it. But famously, this can't be the right view about set theory because of Russell's paradox. So Bertrand Russell points out that what about the description being a set that's not a member of itself? Well, if that set, if there was a set for all the descriptions, that you could come, if for every description there was a set of all and only the objects that match that description, then there would be a set of all the sets that don't include themselves as members, which would be logically impossible because it would both include, if it included itself as a member, it wouldn't include itself and vice versa. So here we have a true counterfactual statement. If naive set theory were right, there would be a set of all the sets that didn't include themselves as members. The contrary statement, if naive set theory was right, there wouldn't be a set of all the sets that didn't include themselves as members, is false. Or like the statement, if naive set theory was true, there would be exactly 10 sets, is false, right? But hold on, these are all counterfactuals with logically impossible antecedents. And Lewis's possible worlds cannot explain this. In fact, Lewis himself, although he doesn't, like I said in the essay, he kind of walks up to the edge of this problem, but he doesn't seem to quite see it. Lewis himself, sort of does a nice job at a footnote in the first chapter of On the Plurality of Worlds of explaining why he can't have logically impossible worlds. That
but he doesn't do it in any interesting ways. He's like, well, they're impossible, aren't they, lol?
Yeah, more or less. I think it's a very clear explanation, but it's not like conceptually interested. It's just like if it says, look, if a possible world were like, if worlds were like stories, right? They're sort of imaginary constructs. Then sure, you could have logical inconsistencies in stories. Like there are logical inconsistencies in stories all the time because like writers are lazy and they don't notice them.
See all of our episodes on time travel.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's a common thing. So there's no problem having inconsistencies in a imaginary construct that's like, okay, if we say possible world, we're just sort of all that's supposed to refer to is just something that we're like imagining about how the world could be, or like some set of propositions about how the world is, or whatever. Then you could have impossible worlds, no problem, right? That you could just have a description that contains some inconsistencies and it's not true, but whatever. Neither are any of the other descriptions besides the one that is true. But if possible world means what it means to Lewis, then you can't, because it wouldn't be like that, right? It wouldn't be like oh, in the world of Back to the Future, when we all say like in the world of Back to the Future, there's inconsistent things are true about whether Marty's trip to the past happened before he left. It would be like it wouldn't be like that. It would be more like if I said in New Zealand contradictions are true. Like, well, given that New Zealand is part of concrete physical reality, if I say that in New Zealand contradictions are true, then I'm saying that contradictions can be true. But There can't be. And so similarly, if I say in this concrete spatio-temporal reality um, that is a Lewis impossible world, a contradiction is true, then there can't then I'd be saying that there's a contradiction in concrete reality, not this part of concrete reality, but that's no better than saying, well, there are no contradictions aren't true in the U.S. or the U.K. They're only true in New Zealand. Like that, what would be wrong with that is the same thing that would be wrong with saying that there could be contradictions in other possible worlds. But certainly, I mean, I guess if you really want to, you could bite that bullet. But if the whole premise of the project here, the whole reason we're talking about possible worlds in the first place, is to sort of explain all these things that seem to be true about possibility and necessity, then look, one of the most basic things we think is true about possibility and necessity is that true contradictions are impossible.
But I think this just leads me to the conclusion that clearly David Lewis is not nearly ambitious enough, and clearly impossible worlds also exist.
There you go. Yeah. Now we're really cooking. Yeah, they don't exist. Whatever. But yeah, I also like we sort of gave this short shrift, but I also like your point at the very beginning of the discussion that um, there is also a sense in which, in trying to explain this starting point, that like, okay, it doesn't seem to be true that what happened is the only thing that could have happened. Clearly, it wasn't inevitable. Clearly, there are all these other things that could have happened. This is the sort of basic picture of reality that we're trying to make sense of when we start thinking about possible worlds. Well, if we believe in concrete possible worlds, then there is a sort of sense in which we've come full circle, or we've lost some of what motivated us in the first place. Because, yeah, it's going to be true that something else could have happened in the sense that it happened at some other possible world where a possible world is a real world. But we're actually right back to saying that this world that we're in is inevitable. That that like there could not have failed to be this world because all the possibilities exist. Because of course this one would. So it's like every single detail of the way things are right now could not have possibly failed. Was inevitable. It could not have not been the case because every possible arrangement of how things could be is the case. So
Yeah,
I
which
don't.
is just really strange, right? That we've got to a point of like mega necessitarianism, where every logically possible thing will necessarily happen because all logically possible things necessarily exist.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know, like it does feel a bit strange for David Lewis to bring into existence these infinite worlds, but then go, well, actually, no, the ones with logical contradictions aren't allowed.
Yeah. I mean, it is. It is. It. I mean, I think that. I mean, the strange thing about it is that, like, otherwise anything goes, right? Like that.
I mean, almost everything goes anyway. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
like, there's like under David Lewis's possible worlds. There's like a universe with one giraffe in it, with two giraffes in it, all the way up to infinite giraffes, and nothing
Yeah.
else. And it's like
Yeah.
like
Right.
every more or
There
less
is an
every
infinite
fucky thing you
subset
can think of.
of the set of all possible worlds. Within the set of all possible worlds, there's an infinite subset of worlds that only contain giraffes, including ones with only one. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, that's
Like that compared to a world where like there's like possibly a contradiction in New Zealand. Like the giraffe world seems a lot weirder than the one contradiction in New Zealand world,
yeah.
where there's a mountain of
Otherwise,
impossibility in New Zealand or whatever.
yeah. Otherwise, everything is exactly the same as it is in this world, except there's one whiteboard somewhere in New Zealand where somebody's just drawn a round square. Um, yeah. No, I get that. I mean, I think that like to be fair to Lewis, I think that what's sort of driving him to reject Impossible Worlds, and like I actually think that like this part's totally right. It's just that I don't I don't think he's quite realized that in rejecting it, he's like undermined some of what he's trying to do. But like is that he's says, look, I mean, if we're trying to make sense of all of these things that seem to be true about possibility and necessity, that it's true, that there are lots of things that could have been true. There's some things that couldn't have been true. And, the like, anything except contradictions is at least logically possible. There's, but like part of the out of that set of basic claims that we start with that we're trying to make sense of, that we're trying to make more systematic, that's his project. Like one of those claims is that uh, you know is surely like one of our most basic beliefs about possibility and necessity is that if that if you're saying two things that can't both be true, then they cannot in fact both be true. That if you're saying A and not A, and you're not like slightly changing the meaning in the middle of the sentence or anything, but like you literally mean A and not that exact same A, then that can't be true. I mean, that
I
does
mean,
seem.
I'm sure that's true right here, but I'm not confident of its like absolute power over the whole multiverse, especially when it's not even true in the world of Marty McFly
The world with which?
with Marty McFly.
Oh yeah. Yeah, like, but I mean, when we were talking about time travel, I mean, we did think that there can like the fact that this would be inconsistent is like sort of proof positive that it's not right. Um, so again, I do think that that would be
I
like a
mean,
person.
I think there's definitely a distinction, but in the same distinction, there's a distinction between like physically possible worlds and metaphysically possible worlds and logically possible worlds.
Yeah,
Um, but I don't necessarily think that the set of logically possible worlds is the same size as the set of conceivable possible worlds. Like, I think it's possible that the set of conceivable possible worlds is larger than the set of logical possible worlds.
yeah. Where so conceivably possible worlds just means what, like a world that we could describe.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a term that gets used a lot, conceivability in philosophy, but I'm not really clear on what it should or could
Yeah,
mean.
I mean, I think that a lot of times, and there's a lot of loose talk about conceivability. I think, like, because what it sounds like it means is like it's about like our mental states. Like, I can actually
Yeah,
imagine it in my head, but I
it's
think given
presumably not that.
the way that people use it, I don't quite think it can mean that. Because like a lot of times, I think we're talking about things that it's like, no, I don't really have any very clear mental picture of. I just, like I I wonder if once we really drill into what we mean by conceivable, if there's a way to do that without any kind of appeal to internal consistency. I should also say, by the way, just a little footnote. You just mentioned this very common idea that there are these three kinds of possible worlds. There's what is it? There's the logically possible, metaphysically possible, and physically possible, right? So physically possible worlds are worlds that have the same physical laws.
You
That
can't have infinite giraffes in that one.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, maybe you can, but they'd have to be really spread out.
yeah, right. But it's like more or less like that's they have you could possibly have infinite drafts, but like there are like lots of crazy. You could certainly have I don't know, Caesar. Uh, not going to the Senate House on the Ides of March. That if he, maybe you would have had to like tweak, assuming really strict determinism, you might have to tweak the starting conditions a little bit. But after that, right, you could have all the same physical laws and have him not do that, or have Hitler win World War II or whatever. And then on the other end, there are logically possible worlds. Just okay, any world where the laws of logic are the way they are now. I will say this in between category of metaphysically possible worlds always seemed weird to me.
Oh yeah, I
Like,
don't know. I don't really know what it means. It's one of those things like conceivable. Like, what counts?
yeah, I'm a little iffy about whether
I
anybody.
mean, I don't know. Maybe it's like, if we hold that physicalism is metaphysically true, um, then it holds
Oh,
true
go
that
on.
everything has to be physical on a metaphysical level. That's probably a bad example because it ties us
No,
back
that's
into
fun. I kind of
to.
like that. So you could have like, yeah, I'm just trying to think of. So you could have like a world where, uh,
Well, I mean, maybe we could say that you have. It's metaphysically true that in every world everything follows a set of self-consistent rules,
yeah,
which it could be metaphysically true if we hold that to be the case, but it wouldn't be logically necessary or true.
yeah. I mean, actually, I think the physical example is physicalism example is interesting, right? Because you could maybe have like, um, worlds where like I don't know. So I'm just trying to construct this so we're not violating any. Or no, we can violate the physical laws if we want to. That's fine. So because we're not talking about physical possibilities. So yeah, we could have. Yeah, we can just have worlds where like dualism about mind body dualism is true. That's those would be.
I mean, 'cause
Um,
it relates to the zombies debate, right? Because the point of zombies, philosophical zombies, which are people or humans or people who have brain psychos but don't have mind psychos or don't have qualia or something like this. The point of them is not to say there might be one walking around, but
right.
merely to say it's metaphysically possible, in which case it's metaphysically false that physicalism is true, even if it is can still be true locally.
Yeah. Right. So the idea, my understanding about the zombie argument, which is I wonder, by the way, when that name was invented because it's
Right.
sort
I
of,
mean, it must have been in like the 70s or something, right?
uh, but yeah, philosophical zombie is somebody uh, who's behaviorally
1974.
all right. Okay, interesting. Yeah. So like Romero zombies were already a thing when philosophical zombies were invented. Yeah. So philosophical zombie is somebody who uh, is behaviorally 100% indistinguishable, is both physically and behaviorally 100% indistinguishable from you or me. That if you did brain surgery on a philosophical zombie, you'd see all the same stuff you'd see if you did for brain surgery on you or me. And if you I don't know, you punch
Yeah,
them.
if you like show them a picture of the pig, like the same neural stuff would light up. Like there is something going on there.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But they just don't experience anything. They're not actually they're not actually having the what's going. They're not actually having the experience that you or I would have seen the picture of the pig. Where they're if you punch a philosophical zombie in the face, the same nerve endings will be triggered in the same way, and they'll yelp in pain, just like you or I would, but they won't actually experience any pain because a philosophical zombie doesn't experience anything. And yeah, so like the idea I think of a philosophical zombie is if you really want to be a hardcore physicalist, you have to say that it's not just that there aren't any, nobody thinks there are, but that like there couldn't be, that somehow you're like describing something that's incoherent, that doesn't make sense. That but like doesn't seem incoherent. right? It seems totally coherent. It seems like we've seen, like I feel like I can, I mean, this kind of brings us back to conceivability because, I have the possibly misleading impression that when I hear somebody describe that, I understand them perfectly.
Right?
Uh,
It seems conceivable, but metaphysically impossible or
yeah,
false.
yeah, right. So that could be okay. So a world with philosophical zombies might be metaphysically impossible. Oh yeah, I like that. That could that could be right. All right, I withdraw my objection. Metaphysical possibility is fine.
Right? And conceivable but not metaphysically possible is the most common position on the Phil Paper survey on zombies. Ta-da!
Interested. Yeah, I don't.
We've worked it out.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Um, yeah, if I had to fill out that survey, there's so many questions. I just go, I don't know.
Are you a one boxer or a two boxer, Ben? Do you remember this one?
To be totally honest, um, do you want to tell people what Newcomb's puzzle is?
Let me try to remember exactly because if you get the details wrong, you can f it up. But basically, there's on a table with two boxes where basically you can risk. There's two boxes with uneven amounts of money in it. I can't remember exactly the figure, but say
Yeah,
there's
so it's something like the first box definitely has like $100 in it or something, and the second box, so that's like 100% for sure. Uh, and the second box might or might not have like $1 million in it. But the big wrinkle here, and it's up to you whether you open both boxes or just the second, just the second box. But the big wrinkle here is there's like a predictor. I always imagine the predictor is like
right.
Dr. Manhattan from Watchmen, who has some sort of supernatural ability to like detect, how objectively likely something is to happen, and crucially, he's not making it happen anyway. He's just predicting the based on these correct probability assessments.
And he's not completely infallible. It's not that important for the thing, but he's like 99.9999%
Yeah,
accurate.
yeah. So
And the question is when you're sitting and basically
so,
the
so
point with the predictor
yeah,
is that if he thinks you're a person who'll pick both boxes.
right. So my memory of this is that uh, the predictor has. I don't think the predictor is actually causing anything to happen. The predictor is just making a prediction. It's just that that there's a 99.99% chance that he's right because he has these like not quite infallible but very close to infallible. Uh, he and the predictor says if you if you if you open both boxes, uh, the second one will be empty. But if you only open the second box, it'll have the $1 million in it. Um, and so the question is, rationally, people will always like misinterpret this as a question about like what would you actually do, which
Or
is
like
like a
risk,
yeah,
It's
yeah,
not a
how
question about risk.
right? It's that they always reinterpret it from an interesting question about rationality to an uninteresting question about personal psychology. But
Right.
the question is not what would you actually do, but the question is like what would the rational thing to do be?
What's the best average outcome you could get? And
Yeah,
the interesting we've explained it badly here.
yeah.
But the very interesting thing is everyone who hears it thinks it's completely obvious what the answer is. But people will
almost
be
almost
split on
everybody.
what answer that is.
Yeah, almost everybody does think that. So yeah, usually people. So like the argument for the one box solution, you should only open the second one, is if you have if there's a 99.99% chance that if you do something you'll get $1 million, but if you don't do it, you only get $100. then you should do that thing, which is,
It seems like a good argument, but I'm a two boxer, so
yeah. I mean, it seems like an excellent argument, but then the two box argument is, hold up, there's no possible way that you'll get less money because remember, it's not. There's nothing that after
right, because the
that,
situation is you're sat in front of them and whatever's in there is in there.
yeah,
And the two boxer
exactly.
says, "Well, fucking, I'm gonna open both of them.
Yeah,
Nothing can happen now."
it's not like the money would. It's not like when you open the first box, the money dematerializes for the second box. It's already,
Or even if you make when you make the decision in your head while you're sat there.
yeah, exactly. The money is already in there before all. The money is either in the second box or not in the second box before all of this is explained to you. And so the argument is, well, come on, the there's no possible scenario on every possible. There are only two possibilities here, and on both of them, I will be richer at the end if I open both boxes. Either there is no money in the second one, in which case I'll have $100 rather than zero if I open the first one, or there is money in the second box, in which case I will have $1,100,000 rather than just $1,000,000. Either way, I'll be better off. That also seems like a really good argument, and most people seem to be just dogmatically attached, just think it's like blindingly obvious which one of these arguments is better than the other one.
Right, and I think
And
it's because people are conceiving themselves in two different ways. Like
uh,
the two boxers are imagining themselves just sat in front of the two boxers. Well, I think one boxers are kind of imagining they're doing like kind of a virtue ethics thing about being like the right sort of person who would get the $1,000,000.
yeah, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, I mean, I probably, I mean, gun to the head, I guess two bucks, but honestly, honestly, this is one of those things that teaching is kind of ruined for me because in my at Rutgers in my LERP classes, logic, reason, persuasion, the this is an example I do a lot in class, and um, it's I spent so much time trying to get people who could only see the force of one or the other of these arguments to see the other
The
one,
other one.
that by the end of the process, I sort of forgot what my own intuition was about this. Like it's kind of muddled. Like I think
Well,
that
you've got to say two boxing because two boxing is the fuck it we ball option.
fair enough.
But it is true that like I think decision theorists are overwhelmingly two boxers now. But obviously
Okay,
that it does depend on interpreting it in a certain way. It's just that interpretation has become hegemonic. But I do think it's a really really fun puzzle because of that, and it's one of those things where like it's such a nerdy technical thing that people will get furious about it. Like there was a guy on Reddit Ask Philosophy who was like, "Why does anyone still two box?" And when we told him that actually nearly all decision theorists two box, he was fuming.
yeah, no, it's yeah. I think it's just one of those things people seem like because whichever one of these arguments um, has managed to take over your brain as you're thinking about it. They both have a way of like making, if you're seeing it through this lens, it just seems so obvious to you. It's very frustrating that other people that it's that other people it's not obvious to other people. And in fact, this other thing that seems totally wrong to you somehow feels obvious to them. Yeah, I think in a advanced socialist society where everybody's material needs are met, there will probably be murders over this.
Yeah, like in Russia where you hear about people shooting each other over Kant.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
In Konigsberg, whatever it's called now, Kaliningrad,
Yeah.
where he was from, which is cool. I'm glad that like somehow the spirit is remained. Like the Russians are not shooting each other over Kant in like Strava, Russia, or Leningrad or whatever. They're shooting each other over Kant, where Kant is from, as if his like world spirit is still there in a powerful way.
Nice.
Cool. But yeah, so if Ben is ever in need of a philosophy essay, or if anyone's kind of inspiring to go on the same path he has, you can just scroll down the Phil paper survey until you find one you like and just write an essay on that.
Fair enough.
Um, Ben, are you doing Gnostic Marx next week? Please say
I,
yes.
I'm not doing Gnostic Marx. If I was going to do Gnostic Marx, I'd probably have to.
That's for Jacobin. Clearly, it's an important
Yeah,
work.
I gotta save that for Jacobin. That is a fascinating question. Whether I could talk Megan into letting me do that at Jacobin, but in any case,
I mean, there's tweets with thousands of likes about it. Is that, and it has Marx in the title. How can that not be a Jacobin article? It's
yeah,
vaguely relevant on the internet, and it's about Karl Marx. Bidla bingla bang.
look forward to that in Jacobin. Uh, but on philosophy for the people, it it is. Yeah, it is time for a Marxy one, but it's not going to be about Gnosticism. Um,
Tragic.
it's, um, it's going to sort of look at some material that we've done in the past, but in a slightly different light, and in a way that actually kind of connects to the joke, if it was that I just made about Newcomb's puzzle, which. So it's called I'm a Marxist and an atheist, but I don't believe religion will wither away under socialism.
Hmm. Oh, so we're doing like shit empiricism.
Yeah.
We're doing future history.
Yeah. We're doing. I'm very hypocritically doing what I just took Lewis to task for, and making claims about concrete reality. You
Okay,
know,
well, next week on sociology for the people.
yeah, from my armchair. Uh, but there we have it.
Um, someone in chat was talking about Uncle Ted. And I was looking back at his his New York Times published bestseller, and I think the interesting thing about reading Industrial Society in the future now is how his like critique of the left is exactly something you can see reproduced on Twitter, which is bad, but not for the reason that he was like an insane maniac or whatever, but from the fact that it shows that there's been no real development in this kind of
Yeah,
post-left, anti-left, but leftist, whatever kind of thinking, and that the left is being critiqued for the same things that he was writing about, 40 years ago or 30 years ago, while presumably things have actually moved on.
yeah. Um, I don't know. I guess my main thought about Ted is well, Alexander Coburn's, which, as I remember at the time, his comment was that some of us could write well enough to get our essays published without attaching them to bomb threats. um, but I don't know. I mean, like, I actually did sort of briefly think about trying to see if Jackman would let me write something about Ted Kaczynski, just because, just because I think that thinking about the opposition to industrial civilization, might be a good jumping off point for for one of my hobby horses that I often write about there, which is that, like, one of the basic things that a lot of people miss about Marxism that I'd like, that I'm sort of obsessed with trying to get them to get is that, Marx doesn't think capitalism is an avoidable moral mistake. He thinks that it's a necessary stage of historical development that creates the industrial base for a society of egalitarian abundance in the future, and why that's a good thing, why that's a necessary thing, and why
Yeah, I
primitivism.
mean, and Ted's a lot better than all the kind of trad people you'll see online, because all the trad people online, all they glorify is like a randomly picked earlier stage in capitalist modernity.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, you can't be trad for the 50s because the 50s happened in modernity, and modernity is like a self-annihilating machine of social forms.
Yeah, we're just going to do the 50s, but magically not have the 60s.
Yeah, like
Yeah. Like it's like, oh, you really? So what you're trad for is something that lasted for 10 years.
yeah, or like less, like it's like insanely like at least
I
being
remember
horny for feudalism.
that was kind of the old Family Guy joke about the Amish that they're like doing it's like the Amish prayer ceremony where they're all like chanting about in unison about how the exact point that's like God approves of, was like this exact level of technological development a few hundred years ago, no more, no
Right,
less.
and I mean, yeah, the Amish are completely like a modernist development.
That's true.
They're completely modern and wouldn't be anything without modernity. But anyway,
Yeah, no,
um,
and I think that well, yeah, that's also true. I mean, like you couldn't have. I mean, not only is what the Amish insist on going back to something that's, yeah, at a very early stage of the modern world, but definitely a stage of the modern world, right? That's the level of technology that they fetishize, but also like they're also a artifact of the modern world insofar as like they obviously couldn't have existed in the Middle Ages because you need like a certain degree of political liberalism for the Amish to be allowed.
right, they would all be arrested and
Yeah,
and then burned at the stake for being annoying and
yeah,
Protestant.
exactly.
Um,
Um, anyway, I
well,
decided to. I thought about it, but I decided to leave Ted's corpse alone. Um, write about something else. I guess I would say that a point I saw Donald Parkinson making on Twitter is that at least Kaczynski uh, doesn't really, if you read him, he doesn't really have the dumbass romanticized notion of what primitivism would entail. He kind of acknowledges how horrible it would be, but like whatever. He thinks that's like the better and more noble path or whatever, which is still insane. But like there is something that's fundamentally more honest about it.
yeah, and he doesn't seem like someone who's really horny for it.
That's fair.
'Cause
Um,
I think the only people that will acknowledge there being horrible things to come are people who are horny for horrible things to come. Anyway, on that note, we should stop. Once I've found the graphic. There we go. Bye everyone.